Now, I'm going to bring up Peter up to the stage. Peter is actually going to be in the EPAM booth after his talk, so if you want to continue the conversations, he's going to be available. I did ask him one question before we bring him up. I asked him, if you were a tree, which one you would be? His answer was the poplar tree or the nyarfa. I really like that answer because it's like these huge trees and everything. He kind of explained it to me. I didn't know that was their name. Now I know. Let's welcome Peter onto the stage with a round of applause.
Thank you very much. So what I will talk about, my name is Péter Verhás and I work for EPAM Systems, and what I will talk about today, let me just remove that other window from there. I think that's, I will do a demo afterwards and, okay. What I will talk about is documentation. And I was a little bit afraid creating this talk because this is a boring topic. And I was thinking that nobody will be here. And I see that there are a lot of people here and I like that. And yesterday there was also a very nice presentation about documentation, how to create documentation. And I would say that what I focus on is the second largest problem of documentation. The first largest problem is that it has to be written. And whenever I was approaching with my ideas and what I was working out, developers, many times I was refused because developers, I go and say that you can make a documentation better. You just don't need to copy-paste information from your source code. Instead of you should enrich it, and then it's a little bit more work to do that. So why would I do that? Because then your documentation will be more resilient to change. It will be less work to update. I don't care. It's the matter of the people who will update. It's not me. Maybe me, but later, not now. And when I was talking to managers, they were very much interested because they understand that the quality of the documentation is very important. Yesterday, Mr. Falco was talking about how we can write documentation, how we create it. Today, I will talk about how we can manage that documents don't get outdated. And the answer is not new, and it's not something that I have invented. I created a tool that tries to enhance this methodology. And the answer generally is document as code. What is it? Let's have a look at an example what problem we have. Here is a documentation from Flexmark, which is essentially a markdown converter. What is the problem with it? Can anyone see what the problem is here? I was reading this documentation. Based on this documentation, I incorporated it in my code, and it didn't compile. Why? Because the version, the real version, is not the same as in the documentation. In the documentation, they included a future version which was envisioned. We could have the version automatically. And bear with me, version is only one example. This is the very first thing that comes into my mind, because that's always changes. But that's only one example. So what do people do? They say that, okay, let's use the latest version. That's the problem here. It says the latest version, but when I'm looking at the documentation, I want to copy-paste it. I don't want to really have a deep understanding of that XML structure and say that, okay, now I will study this XML dependency structure. It's something I've done a lot of times. I want to copy it, and I don't want to look up where the latest version is coming from. The documentation should give me the information I need and not tell me where it is. Computers shouldn't tell me what I should do that a computer can do for me. So what is document as code? Documentation is not code. Documentation is originally a different aspect. It's done usually by tech writers, but not always. Developers should also participate in the documentation process. But these writers are not technical people, but they are tech writers, so they have some kind of technical affinity. So they can use technical tools. So let's use technical tools for the documentation. And then the software evolves as the documented system, what we want to document, evolves. Then the documentation should also evolve. And there are bugs in the documentation. If there are, then what do we do with the code if there are bugs in the documentation? We fix them. We create tests to discover these bugs. Let's try to do something the same with the documentation as well. And why do we have these bugs? The reason is because the documentation is redundant by its nature. When we are programming, we don't like redundancy. But that's not true. Because if you think about that, and I have, let's say, a loop, and the optimizing compiler is exploding that loop, and instead of looping around 5 times, it just repeats the same code 5 times because that's faster. And it's optimized for speed and not for memory. Then the generated code is redundant. It's the source code where we strive for being dry. Don't repeat yourself. So redundancy is an enemy. With the documentation, the processor is the reader who is reading it. When I am reading the documentation and it says that latest version, then it's a source code. It says that we have somewhere at one place in the documentation latest version. We don't want to repeat it. Therefore, go there, but I don't want to go there. I am the processor. Generate a documentation that I can directly consume. So let's think about documentation as documentation source and documentation compiled, which is the final, well-formatted, with bold characters, italic, indented documentation. Document as code tries to eliminate these bugs. And what kind of bugs can we have? Well, 2 different bugs: language, grammar, style, kind of things. That comes from the nature of the language we are using, the human language, English, Hungarian, German, Spanish, whatever language we are using. And the other one is that the documentation lags behind the documented system. The documented system evolves, and the documentation does not follow it. That's a very common thing. But also there are some other sources for inconsistencies, which may really happen. How do we address these things? So when it's a language or grammar or style, then we are using personal productivity tools like Grammarly. I use it a lot. You can use ChatGPT to fix your grammar or style of English. Especially for me, I'm not native English. It's a blessing. Then you can use some automated tools for checking things. And last but not least, it's very important, and you should never underestimate the power of the review processes, and the regime, how you maintain the documentation, what the people who are working together, how they should cooperate and what they should do together. I'm not focusing on that in this talk. Feature lag and inconsistency. What can we do not to have this? Well, I say that if something can be automated, then it must be automated. That's what we do everywhere in the last 7,000 years as humans, since our civilization started. We automate more and more things. Right now, people say that even we automate thinking with artificial intelligence. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. I don't know that. But what we can do that if I could give a task, like copying the version number from the source code, from a POM file, if it makes sense for you, into the documentation. And I could give this task when I'm updating a new release and I want to update the documentation. I could give it to an assistant who is clever, but not an expert, a mechanical work kind of. Then I could give this task to a software. Why not have a software that does it for me? I can fetch some code automatically from the documentation. I can dog signal part of the documentation. Like, you know, the dogs are making signals here and there, signing their territory. So I can also sign that this piece in the code is documented here. And then I could say in the documentation that this documentation, this part, a few sentences, is about this piece of code, and the hash code of this piece is this. And when I'm processing the documentation, compiling the documentation source into the final formatted, printed PDF, HTML, whatever version, this compilation process will tell me that, hey, it doesn't match. The hash code is different. The source code has changed. Maybe the documentation also has to be changed. And then I look at it. Many times, it's just reformatting or refactoring, not affecting the functionality of the code. Then I just update the hash code. But sometimes I realize that, oh yeah, here is a part in the documentation where I was referring to this part of code and it's changed and I have to write it differently. And then I update the documentation and I do not forget that. And if you are looking at open source software documentation on the net, many times you see documentation which is referring to old versions and it's not updated because nobody is aware of that. The other problem is that when I'm reporting it, even then they don't update it, but it means that nobody is caring about that, but that's a different story. I cannot deal with that. And when the documentation is inconsistent in the sense in itself, then I can use, don't repeat yourself, automated, quote-unquote, automated copy-paste. The first part is the good old Docker code, if it's old. It's not old, but... And the new approach is what I propose, and also I will show you an example, a little demo, and the tool that I created in the last 27 years. The final version which I promote right now is I started 5 years ago. And it's open source Apache, so it's not a commercial thing. It's nothing to do really with my employer, with EPAM, other than that EPAM is very much encouraging developers to participate in open source. And the tool is a macro language. So the thing is, the approach, the technical approach is that when you are documenting something, then you use a markup language, ASCII-Doc, or Markdown, or if anyone knows APT, which was used by 15 years ago, you can use anything, LaTeX, whatever. And above that, you can use a meta markup language, which is a macro language. And I named it 27 years ago Jamal, because at that time it was just another macro language, but it doesn't sound really good, just another. Jamal stands now for Jamal Macro Language. And then you get an input text, you process it, and then you get an output text. Very simple thing. Here is the URL, by the way, where you can download it, play around. The full documentation you can see there. Where is the power of this tool? Just a converter, a simple converter. Where the very first version, 27 years ago, was just 300 lines of Perl code. Now it's approximately a few tens or 100,000 lines of Java code. It's long. It has a lot of feature. And the power is that during the 5 years, it developed to be a really powerful tool because you can use it. Well, the very first is mentioned it's DocX Word, Microsoft Word, which is the least important thing. You should never use for documentation Word, but it still works with Word. It was a challenge to do that, but you can use it in JavaDoc, you can use it with ASCII-Doc, you can use it with Markdown, with essentially any text-based format. You can use it even in your Java source code to generate Java source code enhanced with macros if you need that. But that's not documentation, first of all, and if you need that, you have to think about what you are doing wrong, because probably then you are doing something wrong. You can use it even in your POM XML files, enhancing the POM XML, or in YAML files. And the macros, there are several sets of macros, a few hundred different built-in macros in addition to the user-defined macros that you can write yourself, or you can create built-in macros if you want to program it in Java for yourself. Core macros, snippet handling, so documentation handling, scripting like you can insert JavaScript, Ruby, Groovy, or Basic into the documentation itself, and it's executed when the documentation is processed. You can include plant UML or just any diagram language into your documentation. We will see that with Markdown, actually, in the demo, and many other things. So what will be the demo? For the demo, I will use the ASCII-Doc plugin of IntelliJ, because it's not the only thing, again, like as I said with the version number, it's a good example. It's a very usable part, but it's one integration where you can use it. And this Jamal plugin integrates into the ASCII-Doctor plugin as a preprocessor. What it does is that if you copy the Jamal code, the jar files, into your project under the .asciidoctor/lib directory, and then you configure your IntelliJ to recognize the files which have the JUM extension. By convention, you can do it differently, but I recommend that you do it that way. And you configure it that telling ASCII-Doc that telling IntelliJ that everything that ends with .jum is an ASCII-Doc file, and then even you say that, yes, I want to execute it, I trust this code, because IntelliJ always says, hey, there are some third-party code trying to run from this project directory. Do you allow it to run? And then you click on, I've checked the code, I trust it, enable them anyway. And yes, this is when you say that it's ASCII-Doc. Then what you will get is the following. I will show you, and then let me see how visible it is in demo mode, or I just try to increase it, or can you see what's there? Maybe. So this is a Markdown documentation, and what I want to do is to create some documentation about some software. And first of all, I want to write the reference to the dependency. And what you can see here is, why don't I see on the right side? It doesn't show, I mean, it's a demo effect, sorry about that. Let me just reopen it. Maybe it's yeah. And no, it's the display. It was showing. It's showing on my first screen. It doesn't show on the second screen. Why? I don't know. Oh my God. Let me. Let's just do screen mirroring. Maybe then it works. Sorry? Maybe I can, if I quit the presentation mode, that may help. Yeah? And also I quit and reopen, maybe. Hope it helps. Yes, it does. Okay. What you see here is that I immediately get the result. And what you see is actually is that I am fetching the group ID and the artifact ID and the version number from the POM file of the project. And this POM file is an XML file. And when I say here a macro, snip XML on the third line, it reads up this XML, and I give a name inside this documentation. It will be called POM, P-O-M, and then I am referring to it. And I am immediately seeing that the group ID is empty, and the reason for that is it's a multi-module project, and the artifact and the group ID is not defined in this POM. It's defined in the parent POM, which is one directory above. So I can just change that, and I immediately get the parent POM. And if I am ever just processing this document again, if the version changed, then I will get the new version. And right now it's a snapshot version. So what I can do further is that I make it a chapter, and I want to include some source code. This source code is somewhere there in the files, and I can just include it, saying that I want this sample, a snippet, which is named array. Now, what you see is that there is a warning that it doesn't know this snippet. It's not defined. Why? Because I should tell the system where it is. First, for efficiency, it reads all the snippets, then keeps an internal database in the memory, and then it works with these snippets afterwards. And what you can see here immediately that I have the sample there. I didn't have to copy-paste it. I'm just referring to it, and it's automatically gets into my Markdown file. And if you look at this, actually, that it's an md.jump, but here is the Markdown file itself. So if I'm committing this into GitHub, then anyone can have a look at it, and I will have the document as it is as a Markdown here. It's immediately updated. Okay, but what I also want is that I want this sample to be numbered. So I say that I use another macro, which says that let's number these lines, and then the lines are numbered. But, you know, it ruins the indentation, because the lines from 1 to 9 is only 2 characters. The rest is 3 characters. So let's do something differently. And let's say that I want to specify a format. Why not? I can give parameter to this number lines macro, which is part of the snippet package. And then it's different. And then let's say that I have another sample. And then what can I do? Well, actually, I could copy-paste this code, but I shouldn't copy-paste even in documentation. I should never do copy-paste. But what I can do is that I define a macro for it. Whenever I am doing some repetition in the documentation, I can define a macro for it. So let's say that I want to have a macro like this, a sample, which has one parameter, the name of the snippet. And what I will have is that I will have a snippet, Java, formatted. I format the line numbers. I number the lines. And at the end, I even want to have a link to the snippet. Because when I'm reading the documentation, I see the snippet, I want to go to the file where the snippet is. It's very easy. Actually, yesterday, when there was this presentation about documentation, the Markdown snippet, which is doing something just like this, nothing else, just fetching snippets and putting into Markdown. So Markdown specific and only for snippets, nothing else. It was using this link, and I was thinking about, well, it's a good idea. Should I modify the code? No, I just need to write that one line at the end, line 22, and then it's there because it's programmable by the macros itself. And then I can use this. And instead of writing the snippet name there, I am using the macro. I have a macro for that. And then if I have the next one, it's very easy to use because all I need to do is sample hello world. I am including now hello world. Okay, what else do I want with Markdown? Well, I want to number these chapters. Some Markdown supports you, and you can number the chapters. Markdown, some markups. Markdown cannot. ASCII can do it for you, so it's not a good argument to use just because you want to number the chapters. But in this case, Markdown doesn't support. But I can define a counter, and then I can say that I just want to use this chapter counter here. And what you see here is it becomes number 1. And then I can just insert chapter, and then we will see number 2. And then similarly, number 3. And also, I want to use cross-references. So I just say that, again, a macro without any argument. The array chapter macro will get the value of the chapter counter, the latest value. If I use latest, it doesn't increment. It just fetches the latest version, latest number. And then I can reference to it and write that the array chapter is 2, yeah? And of course, these counters can be formatted, and then it can be alphabetic, Latin, Roman numeral, Arabic numerals, whatever. Very versatile. Okay, now let's have another chapter, some UML. Can you insert plant UML into Markdown? But maybe you can with some tools. Can you insert some other different diagrams into Markdown? Well, with this macro language, you can either do it because there is already a macro for that, or you can do it because it's very easy to extend a little bit, but the philosophy behind it and the technology behind it is the same. What I do is that I just invoke the plant UML macro, which in this case is the word simplest UML A to B. And what it does is invokes plant UML as a library, generates the SVG file, which is the UML diagram, and then returns the name of the file. How will I get it into Markdown? Well, I reference it as a file name, as an image name. And then, here you go. The interesting thing is then, when I was first meeting Crocky, I don't know if you know Crocky. It's a web service that knows many different text-based diagram processing thing. And what you can do is that you can convert your text into base64 textual format, and then you put it into an HTTP request into the URL, and the response is the generated SVG graphic. And then I said that, okay, what I really need is a macro which can just convert a text to base 64. I already have one. At that time, I already had it. I didn't need to write. What I also need is a macro that can execute a GET request to an HTTPS URL. But I have that, because whenever you are referring to any file, you can refer to any URL in this macro language. So I have that. What should I do? Then I just can write a macro that converts the content of the macro to base 64 and then puts it into a URL and then uses the result as an image. If it's a markdown, then in a markdown syntax. If it's an ASCII doc, then ASCII doc. I didn't need to write any Java code to do it. It was just a little bit of programming of macros. So, I think that's the demo. And then let's go back to the presentation and then so we still have like 5 minutes, which we will use for questions. But what is the summary and the takeaway from this? If nothing else, then you should remember and you should keep in mind that document update and document maintenance, partially at least, can be automated. Forget Word, forget Confluence. They are evil for documentation. Well, they have their places in different parts of the business, but for code and technology, document as code is what we have to follow. Treat your document as code, yes. Put it into the continuous integration, continuous development, process it, and if the processing of the document fails, then fail it, but also apply the principles like dry, solid, and think about every other principles like Demeter principle about object orientation. I don't think it makes sense, but if it does, then you should apply it to document management. Apply every coding practice into documenting practice if it makes sense. And if you liked the demo, then use my tool. And if you have any question, you're welcome. I am ready to answer any question. And if we run out of time, after I pack my things together, I will walk over to the EPAM booth, and I will be there so long as there is anybody needing me. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Peter. We have Slido up and running, so if you haven't entered a question, this is your time. We got a couple of minutes to go through them. Let's tackle the first one. Any chance that Jamal can work without Java dependencies to use it in an NPM ecosystem for JavaScript or TypeScript?
Absolutely. What you need, it's written in Java, but it doesn't. It needs Java to run as an environment because it's written in Java, but it's not tailored to use only Java and Java code documentation. You can use it for anything else to document, and you can run it out of a Docker container if you don't want to have a JVM running on your machine, but I recommend that you install a JVM on your machine and run it from the JVM.
So yeah, you mentioned you could build it into your CI/CD, so this is a
Yes.
good way to kind of run that even on your NPM or any type of TypeScript.
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Does Jamal support mermaid diagrams?
Mermaid diagrams are converted not by a Java code, but it's a different code. Therefore, you cannot write directly a Java code that processes them. But there is a macro package already, the IO package, which can execute any external code. There are security issues with that. You have to configure it on your machine before you can execute a specific code. So it's not just that, hey, I can execute anything that I downloaded a macro and the macro just execute anything. No, you have to configure in your setup. It's a little bit painful, but you have to configure where the main mermaid conversion is, and then it can do exactly the same. You just have to write a few lines of macro code to execute mermaid, generate the document, and then fetch the file name, reference it in your document, and yes, then it works with that. I tried it.
All right, thank you for the question. Whoever asked that. Can you document APIs with this one, or should you?
Yes, I believe, yes, you can. It depends. If you have any better tool for the very specific task, like OpenAI, then you should use that one, because it's very much tailored for that API. But you should always think about the trade-offs. When you are using a very special tool, then it's very good for that very special task, but you cannot use it differently. If your need is a little bit different, you need a PDF and not an HTML, then it may be a little bit more difficult, because OpenAI is generating HTML directly. If you want to incorporate this part of the documentation into some ASCII documentation to include it there, you may have hard time. So you can think about the trade-offs, and then you should decide which one to use, which fits best your intentions and your needs.
Thank you for the answer. Next one is there a place where we can access these slides and another thing for the presentation? So is there a link or?
Well, I usually upload these things into the repository of the code itself, where I'm doing a presentation. I make it part of the documentation. If you will have videos about it uploaded, I will have an article about it. So you will, if you go to github.com/Verhás-Jamal, then it's going to be there soon.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Peter. One more round of applause. And
thank you very much.
Here's a little keepsake from the people of Craft. Just maybe the camera can get to it. Thank you again.